Okay, so we're talking about the fact that at a certain point Nevuah ended and the men of the Great Assembly took over. And what exactly are the men of the Great Assembly? So we said the men of the Great Assembly, there are 120 of them. And they don't seem to be a court, a regular court, because if there were Sanhedrin, there'd be 70 of them or 71 of them. It's not clear, are they legislative, are they administrative, right? Not clear. But let me tell you what they said, okay? You know, Heimamu Shlosha Dvarim. They say three things. I'm in source 2. Hevei Metunim Badin. Hemidu Talmidim Arbeh V'asu Siag LeTorah. So let's go in order, right? Or you know, let's even do it better. Let's go. It doesn't make a difference. Hevei Metunim Badin. Anybody know what the word matun means? So matun actually means no, not latet. Matun is moderate or measured or whatever it is. Now, if you say somebody be moderate, what were they thinking of being? Extreme, radical, right? So let's see how they wanted to be radical. Okay. So for example, if you take a look, they say asus siag LeTorah. What's asus siag LeTorah? For example, make a fence around the Torah. But what's an example of a fence that they made? Shema til Chatzot would be the first Mishnah in Brachot. Would be a nice example, right? What? Mukseh. Right? Mukseh is a great example. Okay? They basically what they're saying is we are intending on creating new laws. New laws which didn't exist before. We're gonna tighten things up. And also Ha'emidu Talmidim Arbeh, we're going to make many students, and we're going to and therefore Hevei Metunim Badim. Let me try and explain where we are historically and what's going on. The Anshe Knesset Dola, even in the academic world, there's a bit of a black hole from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah when they set up the Bet Mikdash till Hanukkah. Right? I put a little timeline just so that people could orient themselves in terms of time. That you have the first temple is destroyed in 586 BCE. Jews are allowed to come back with the Cyrus Declaration and probably return around 536. So actually in Galut for about 50 years. But from Churban to Binyan was something like 70 years, right? So they built the temple in 515. Ezra and Nehemiah come a little while later, and that we all know. And that was still Nevuah at that time. Then, when the Chazal starts writing, right? Shimon HaTzadik Hayami Shiarei Knesset HaGdolah, right? Shimon HaTzadik was from the end. This is already around the time of Chanukah. And the first Mishnayot, Shimon ben Shetach. What happens in those 300 years between Ezra and Chanukah? That's the men of the Great Assembly. That's the Anshe Knesset Gdolah. What are they doing in order to connect us from the period of the Nevi'im to the period of the Mishnah? What's happening there? That's the men of the Great Assembly. Now we don't have external sources for what they did, but we have internal sources. So let's take a few examples of the things they did, which were somewhat radical. So one example is Muktzah. I'll talk about Muktzah in a second, but let's look at a very simple line, which is source number 3. אנשי כנסת גדולה תקנו להם לישראל ברכות ותפילות קדושות והבדלות. Okay? Sounds very simple. But can you imagine a Judaism where there was no brachot, tefilot, kedushot, or havdalot? Let's try. First of all, let's understand what they're trying to do. Okay? So let's start with the tefilot. In the first temple, says the Rambam, there were no daily tefillot. Or in fact, even if there was a chovav tefillah, all you needed to do was, you woke up in the morning, you needed to praise God. So you woke up in the morning, the sun's shining, you get out your door, you say, what a beautiful day. Thank you, Hashem. You're done. There were no 3 tefillot a day. That's all you needed to do all day. Quite something, right? Now, that's all you had to do. What brachot are there? According to the Torah? Birkat Hamazon. That's all there is. Okay? V'achalta v'savata, and that's Birkat Hamazon. That's a very lean Judaism, right? And it's amazing that, maybe it's not surprising, that when Ezra came back after we'd gone into Galut for only 70 years, what did he find? He found that people were intermarrying. He found that nobody was keeping Shabbat. He found that Shabbat was like a market day, and everybody was shopping on Shabbat. He found that Judaism was really, really falling apart. Nobody was looking after the Bet Mikdash. So now the men of the Great Assembly come along and they establish, first of all, brachot. Brachot are really amazing because brachot enable you to put God on your lips on a regular basis. First of all, let's take brachot for food. Not only brachot after food, but Chazal say, right, even before you have food, you should say brachot. But brachot bring God into every single moment. I experienced this very much with one of my kids. With all of my children, when they started being able to read and they started learning, I decided I would have a chavruta with them and I'd learn Masechet Brachot. So, with my oldest son, already we learned Masechet Brachot by the time he was 6 or 7. One day, we decide we're going to the Ashkelon National Park on a tiyul, and it was just after we finished learning Masechet Brachot. And so we go to the national park and we see some archaeological ruins. And we, as parents are, we don't know what they are, but we look at the sign and then we tell the kids. So we say to our kids, this used to be a church, and before that it was a pagan temple. It was a place where they did Avodah Zarah. So my son says, there you go. Masechet Brachot. So he says, so Abba, we've got to say a bracha. I said, what bracha? He says, there's a bracha, right? There's a bracha that if the place where there's Avodah Zarah, Shakar Avodah Zarah Me'aratzeinu. I'm like, anybody ever say this bracha? So I did a thing that like parents do. I said, Baruch Atah. I let him say Shem Hashem, and we say the bracha. Okay, fine. So we're seeing the church. We said Shakar Avodah Me'aratzeinu. We come over the hill. Abba, we've got to say a bracha. I said, what bracha now? He says, Stasi Shasai Tayam Agadol. Right? I don't know. The whole day, all he was doing was finding brachot. Right? Now, it's a very powerful thing to have brachot on your lips every single. It's basically putting Shem Hashem in your life. The idea of brachot tefillot. If you don't have any tefillah, tefillah is an amazing regulator, right? And we know it connects us to all sorts of rhythms of Judaism, of the Korban Tamid, of the Beit HaMikdash. Tefillot keneged avot, keneged korbanot. But the idea that the men of the Great Assembly start establishing the Shemona Esrei. Now again, I don't know if the Shemona Esrei is, if we had to write a Shemona Esrei, if we'd write all those 18 brachot. I don't know if everybody wakes up in the morning and says, I really feel a need for kibbutz galuyot this morning, right? Or you wake up and you're some people I feel this need for, v'lam al shinim al tihi tikva, right? I don't know, but I think it was Rav Soloveitchik who said it, and if it wasn't him who said it, I think I read it also in Franz Rosenzweig, so if they both said it, it's probably got some truth to it, that the Shemona Esrei is not necessarily things that we would need. The Shemona Esrei is things that we do need. And it's almost like a menu. It's a bit like, you could even call it almost like an Ani Ma'amin. It's 18 things which form the Jewish people. So we start with Avot, and then we start with the notion of Mechaya Metim and rain, and then Kedusha, and then the importance of, intelligence, and Slicha, and then we move to national things, like the idea of kibbutz galuyot, and the idea of justice, and the idea of Yerushalayim. And it's almost the things like these are the 18 things that Jews would need, ending off, of course, with shalom and all these things. So, in other words, this almost puts 18 ideas into the Jewish mind 3 times a day. It's a very powerful idea. But even more than that, once you create a Shemona Esrei, once everybody, in the first temple, did people ever pray together? So maybe they had said Tehillim together, I don't know. When they went to the Bet Mikdash, I imagine they did say Tehillim together. We've got evidence from the Bet Mikdash of all sorts of Tehillim. But on a regular basis, did they pray together? I really don't know. We don't have any evidence of things like that. But now you have the same text. Now you can pray together. Once you can pray together, you can have a Bet Knesset. Right? And all those lines, more than Shabbat, more than the Jews kept Shabbat, the Shabbat kept the Jewish people. But I would say, the Bet Knesset, what would we do without a Bet Knesset? That's communal center. It's the place where we celebrate things together. It's the place where we read the Torah. In other words, suddenly with brachot, you brought God into people's lives. right? With tefillot, you've managed to create a central statement, almost like a menu of Jewish beliefs and Jewish needs, and you've enabled us to create the institution of the Bet Knesset. And let's just go to the next two words, which is Kedushot and Havdalot. Kedusha, again, this is fascinating. First temple, Judaism. What did people do on Shabbat? They came home from work, they saw the sun going down, right? They knew they weren't allowed to do melacha. Sun goes down, so they, it's going, okay, I'll go home. What do? They have dinner, right? Now, do they light candles? No. So I think they did light candles, because I think they lit candles on Sunday night, on Monday night, on Tuesday night, on Wednesday night, on Thursday night, and on Friday night, right? In other words, they lit candles every night, right? So they lit candles just like every night, okay? And then they ate dinner. And there was no kiddush, right? There's no tefillah. We just said first temple. They went to okay, they have dinner. They got up in the morning. They don't go to work. If there's a navi in the town, right? No, maybe they would go hear the navi. Right? Remember that with the shunamit, right? Lo chodesh v'lo Shabbat. So maybe they went into the local village for to hear the navi. Maybe there was Kriyat Torah in the local marketplace. Who knows? That was it. They had cold food, and then Shabbat went out. Do you mark it? No, you don't mark it. Suddenly Chazal come along. So first of all, something really cool. You come home, and before the sun sets, not like Sunday, and not like Monday, and not like Tuesday, right? The mother would say, "Lahadlik bracha." Suddenly there's a bracha. These, how are these candles different than all other candles, right? And then when you get to the meal, kiddush b'makom suda. What's kiddush? It's home education, right? It's like, this is, hey, chevra, this is Zeichel HaMaaseh Bereshit. This is Zeichel Yetziat Mitzrayim. This is special dinner, right? And suddenly there'd also be tefillot, right? So now once you have tefillot, now you can have a tefillah on Shabbat morning, and we know how things have developed. Shabbat suddenly becomes, they're thickening Judaism, right? Our whole liturgy, I would really say that in these four words, right, brachot and tefillot, kedusha and havdalot, without these things, I don't think we'd have almost like a Jewish life. It's unbelievable how these four enactions made by the Anshe Knesset Gdolah changed Judaism completely, right? And therefore, Kiddush is the opening ceremony, and Havdalah is the closing ceremony, right? And you really demark the borders of Shabbat. And it's amazing. Now, I even when I read these words and I'm thinking about it now, it's almost not surprising that Judaism fell apart. When we went into another culture and we didn't have these tools, this is like a toolbox which enables us, wherever we are on the globe, to be able to remain connected. Right? So, and I will say that the men of the Great Assembly did lots of other things. I mean, one of the things they did was, as I say, let's just talk for 2 minutes about Muktzah, and then we'll go to the article of Rav Kook, which I put here. But Muktzah is a fascinating one. If you look, I put it in source 4 and 5. In case people think that the rabbis are always piling on all sorts of isurim and they're always getting stricter and stricter and stricter, I like to bring this source, right? Because in this source from Masechet Shabbat, it says, when they wanted to start Muktzah, Barishonah Yomrim Shlosha Kelim Nitalim B'Shabbat. They said, everything is Muktzah. Everything, apart from 3 things. What were the 3 things? Miksuach shel dveila. They used to have fruit cakes, so you can cut that. So you had one knife, and the zuam alistrin shel kedera, which was like your soup ladle. Okay, so they put it into a cup and you drink it from the cup. And sakin ketana she'al gabei hashulchan. That was it. Other than that, everything's muktzah. Now, I once, why? Why did they make everything muktzah? But just by the way, then it says as muktzah people took it on, chazru v'hitiru, chazru v'hitiru, chazru v'hitiru. They made it more and more lenient, right? So I'm just saying, don't say the rabbis are always getting stricter, until they said everything you can touch apart from certain things. Now, what was the idea here? So if you look in the next line, Amar Rabbi Chanina bimei Nechemya ben Chachlaya nishnei mishnazu. This was from the time of Nehemiah, when it said, B'yamim ha'hem ra'iti b'Yehuda dorchim gitot b'Shabbat u'meviyim ha'aremot. So I'll just tell you what was happening in those times. In the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, essentially people were bringing things in from the countryside into Jerusalem. It says there were people waiting outside with fish, with all sorts of things. And you had basically market day. Now, in a barter economy, what did you have? I'll give you a sack of flour, and you'll give me a jar of oil, right? Now, is there anything wrong with that? I give you something, you give me something. And that's when Chazal said you're not allowed to measure things. All these things are muktzah. You're not allowed to make contracts on Shabbat. You're not allowed to... what would they try? They also made dinim of what we call eruvei chatzerot. That you're not allowed to carry from one eruv to the other. What's the whole idea of hotza'ah? The idea of you're not allowed to take from a private place. It's basically what we call import and export, right? What's import and export? You take somewhere from where I take something from my storeroom, I bring it out to the marketplace, you want it, you then take it to your storeroom. That's the whole essence of hotza'ah, but it's the whole essence of business, right? There's a place where there is a supply, there's a place where there's demand, and you make money that way. That they wanted to shut down the marketplace because that was their day off, so they basically spent the day shopping. So as a result of that, they start with a whole bunch of gzerot, of muktzah, and of measuring, and of contracts, and of, and all the eruvei chaterot, and all these sorts of things, because they're trying to create Shabbat. And clearly Shabbat was such a big deal, and it was also so fragile, that I put even here, there is source number 5, you remember that, of course, on Sukkot, if it's Shabbat, we don't shake the lulav. If Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat. Now, again, why were they so strict? And we always ask, we only got Rosh Hashanah once a year. Why did we come up with this gzeirah that we can't even blow the shofar if it's Shabbat? It's clear that Shabbat was under threat. And they realized that without Shabbat, it was all going to fall apart. And therefore, Shabbat became priority number 1. And everything, even things like shofar and lulav and everything had to go by the wayside. But when you think about it, I'll come back to those 3 phrases. Asu siag leTorah. We're making new fences around the Torah. Also, Ha'emidu Talmidim Harbeh. Maybe I'll mention one thing, which is Ha'emidu Talmidim Harbeh. Clearly, they tried to establish teaching. There are also statements that the Anshe Knesset Havdalah promoted various different sofrei stam to write mezuzot and tefillin. And at the same time, they say Hevei Metunim Badin. Be careful. Don't change Judaism too much. Sometimes when I've taught this, and I actually have a class which is a bit longer class where I do even more changes, and a student will always put their hands up and they'll say, Rabbi, but I don't get it. Isn't this reform? Right? So I always say to them, it's reform without a capital R. It's not the reform, but they were reforming Judaism. But always the question is, when you reform something, is it reforming it in order to keep the original as strong, or is it actually morphing it into something else? Right. By the way, that was also the question with reform in the 19th century. They thought that they were modernizing Judaism. They hoped this. It did. In hindsight, it became a sort of a road to assimilation instead of a road to preserving Judaism, which is why reform hasn't been something that we want to look at favorably. And this was very, very radical. But at the same time, it seems like that we actually wouldn't be here today as Jews if it wouldn't be for these changes. Like Ezra, we're only here because of Ezra, right? Judaism was never the same after Ezra, but we're really thankful to him for setting up the Anshe Knesset Olah and making these changes, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. Now, this is a very different atmosphere to the spirit of Nevi'im, right? And this is where I want to talk a little bit about the difference between sages and prophets, and that's where there's the Rav Kook. If people have it, that's great, and if not, how many people don't have it? Oh, we're good. So people have. All right. So, yes.
I have a question about the implementation of the Siyag Torah. So we saw in the Gemara how it was implemented and how they retracted, but how was it initially started among the people? Like, do we understand if it was taken on strongly by the people, or was it more
all right? So I'll give you a strange example, which I don't know what to make of it, right? The Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin says that along came Ezra and he decided to change the language of the Torah and the font of the Torah. Have you ever heard of this? There's something called Ktav Ivri, and there's something called Ktav Ashuri. We use Ktav Ashuri, but then whenever you find archaeology from the first temple, it's in a font that you can't really read. You know what I'm talking about? The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that the font of the Torah was changed by Ezra. And he also wanted to change the Torah and read the whole Torah in Aramaic. The people said, Ezra, you're being too extreme. We want the Torah in Hebrew. We'll change the font, right? But we won't change the language of the Torah. And they kept Lashon HaKodesh. And they decided, okay, we'll accept the Ashuri script. That's a very interesting example whereby they give pushback. And they say, sorry, Ezra, you're too radical. And the Gemara then says, Ezra was the next in level to Moshe. So the Gemara is saying, Ezra was okay. You could have listened to him, but you didn't. Which is like fascinating, no? It's a time when a lot of changes. In the Torah, all the months are called, right? HaChodesh HaRishon, HaChodesh HaSheni, HaChodesh HaShlishi. Suddenly we bring back from Bavel, right? Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz. Some of these are like pagan names. So it's really interesting to think about the changes that happens, in Judaism. And at some point, the people wouldn't accept it. At some point, they did. I guess there was an organic process. Maybe if there were this Anshe Knesset Gedolah, they had enough gravitas, enough authority to stimulate these changes. But I agree, it's radical. So let's talk
How
about.
are they able to exercise their dominance over all the people? All of a sudden, everybody has to say these blessings. All of a sudden, everybody has to pray. All of a sudden.
So the truth is, I don't think everybody accepted it. I think it took hundreds of years. If you learn Ezra and Nehemiah, it's very clear that there were arguments between two types of Jews. There was one type of Jew who thought a lot of the intermarriage was going on with a group of people called the Shomronim. The Shomronim had been brought to Eretz Yisrael 150 years, 200 years before, and they were sort of Jewish and they weren't Jewish. So, they didn't accept Yerushalayim as being special, but they did keep Shabbat. They did some things, they didn't do some things. So clearly there were, and by the way, the Kohen Gadol's son married a Shomroni woman. Okay? So clearly there were groups amongst the Jewish people who said, the Shomronim, they're Jewish enough for us. And Ezra and Nehemiah came and said, they're not Jewish enough for us. And there was an argument. And in the end, Ezra and Nehemiah's type of Judaism won out. And the Shomronim, clearly it was diluting. And those people fizzled out. But I imagine there were groups who were vying for one another, and we're looking backwards 2,500 years later, 2,300 years later, and we see the results of the Judaism we've inherited through them, through the same thing with the Tzedukim and the Purushim, right? So we are the inheritors of the Purushim. But at the time, it was a big fight. So, the Beit Sheni was full of a lot of factionalism and sectarianism. But before the Tzedukim and the Purushim, which is more the Roman period, this was much more the Persian and the Greek period that this was going on. So I don't think it was an easy ride. And just like there are, in every community, there are factions. There's a right wing, there's a left wing. And to a certain degree, to be honest, the funny thing is that here, the people who are making the changes are actually the right wing. Right? Here, Ezra and Nehemiah they seem to be the right wing of the community. And they're trying to, No,
but my question was, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, did they have any sort of political power? What were their?
We don't know enough about it.
We don't know anything about it.
I don't think we know enough about it. Even when I went to university and I studied, history of whatever, all the sources about the Anshe Knesset Gedolah are from the Talmud. We don't have external sources. We don't have, for example, letters of the Persian government writing a letter to the head of the men of the Great Assembly. So. By the way, it's also an interesting question about the Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Was it more like an internal consensus to accept him? And that's in the year 200. How did the Nasiim work? Were they recognized by the Romans, or was it more like just the Jews recognized them? A lot of open questions. Okay, I want to deal with this. I don't want to go on too long, but we're going to look at this wonderful essay by Rav Kook about Chacham Adif Minavi. Now, I just want to explain how traditionally this is understood, Chacham Adif Minavi, and then we're going to see how Rav Kook wants to talk about it. Usually, Chacham Adif Minavi means this. But let's say we're discussing a question of contemporary halacha, right? It's a question of contemporary halacha. We all know the most important question is, whether we can eat meatless meat, right? Or can we use AI, right? Are we going to be able to use a automatic car, right, on Shabbat? What are those ones that they have, the taxis? So we're going to be able to drive those on Shabbat, right? All right, we're going to have peopleless cars. We're going to have meatless meat. We're going to have, I don't know, peopleless people. Anyway, so the question is, like, when we have robots, right? Can the robots, cook for us on Shabbat? These are the questions. So these are what everybody's talking about now. So we're discussing it, and in walks Eliyahu Navi through the door, and he says, "I've got news for you. The halacha is X," and we say, "Eliyahu, that's just lovely that you came with a message from God, but." Lo b'shamayim hi, right? And that's how most people understand Chacham adif min navi. You have to argue it out here, take out the text, discuss it. Chacham adif min navi. We prefer. Now we're in the period of Chachamim. The nevuah has gone away. That's how, for example, the Rambam understood Chacham adif min navi. But Rav Kook, I'm sure people are familiar with the name Rav Kook. Everybody knows. Rav Kook. Died in 1933. Rav Kook made Aliyah in 1904. He made Aliyah. He was appointed to be the first chief rabbi of the not yet country of Medina Israel. But the thing about Rav Kook is that he was a very evolutionary thinker. He really saw things. Blessed the idea of change. He was very into it because he thought that change was always going to be turning for the better. And that's why he was able to see, everybody could see the early Zionists that they'd rejected Judaism. He said, what do you mean they've rejected Judaism? They've come back to the land of Israel. They've come back to make it, that's not rejecting Judaism, that's just a different Judaism. And eventually we're going to have all the pieces are going to come together and they're going to make a much better whole. And therefore he embraced Zionism and he embraced all sorts of things like, art and music, and he spoke at the opening of the Hebrew University because he said, great, we have an institution of higher learning. I don't see this as a threat. I see this as something which can be merged with Torah. Let's take a look at how he looks at this. Okay? And I'm going to do something which is absolutely criminal, and I'm going to read Rav Kook in English. Okay? Because nobody can understand Rav Kook's Hebrew. Okay? So he's going to say like this. Okay, as a rule, poets know how to portray the nobler side of life, its beauty, its dynamism, and its vitality. They also know how to describe the evils of life and to protest them vigorously. So he's talking about poets, artists, and what do artists do? So artists can, half the songs in the charts are about love, the beautiful side of life, right? Or if I go to my British education, right? You can wander, through the daffodils with William Wordsworth, right? And look about the beauty of nature and daffodils and whatever it is. Or you can open Charles Dickens and read about the sweatshops and the orphanages of, Victorian Britain, right? So on the one hand, they know how to show the beauty of life. On the other hand, artists have always been, at the head of protest movements and, recently, I don't know if people saw that Bob Dylan movie, right? But Bob Dylan, had all these anti-war songs in Vietnam or whatever it is. So they know how to show beauty or they know how to protest. But now he says something interesting. Can artists change the world? He says, the passionate force of the imagination is unable to determine the precise factors and conditions that preserve life in its flourishing, and conversely safeguard it from flaws and defects that are liable to have highly destructive consequences. This is a sphere that concerns details, logistics. Here begins the work of physicians, economists, engineers, judges, and all those who pursue practical fields. What's he saying about the difference between poets and practitioners, right? Two P's. Poet and practitioners. Poets can do what? Artists can do what? They describe things beautifully, right? They talk in poetry, music, everybody remembers a song. But are they going to change the world? No. Because let's say, for example, some music artist does a whole thing and raises awareness about, global warming and carbon emissions. Okay, so everybody now knows about it, but what? You're still going to get governments to sign on you're still going to get policymakers to decide whatever. So you've got somebody to create the electric car or whatever it is. And so forth for every single thing, right? When I was a kid, there was a music artist, Bob Geldorf, and he did this Live Aid, Band Aid, right? People who saw the Queen movie, right? The big concert at Wembley, and it was the first international the concert where it was a concert on three continents because they just brought in satellite TV and stuff like that, and they raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and only a fraction of it got to Africa because they didn't know to supply the right food. They didn't know how to circumvent the militias. In other words, you can have the best intentions in the world, but you actually need to think about how to do things practically, or else the whole thing falls down. The best intentions, if you don't know how to do it. And that's what he says. Here begins the work of physicians, economists, engineers, judges, and practical fields. So you've got the dreamers, and you've got the practitioners. Okay. Now, who's going to be who? What does Rav Kook say? Who are the poets? The Nevi'im. The Nevi'im are the prophets. What do? Right? The Nevi'im come along and they say, it's terrible that the king is being so corrupt. It's terrible that the people are doing Avodah Zarah. Right? What do he say? He describes the beauty of Hashem. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Here he says this distinction has higher applications. Prophecy saw the evil force of idolatry in ancient Israel. It fought against it with all its might. It beheld the majesty and beauty of one God and articulated its radiance and splendor. So in other words, on the one hand, it has the beauty of God, but then it says it identified corruption and moral depravity, oppression and exploitation of the poor, murder and adultery, fraud and violent crime. That's quite a list. And religiously impassioned, it sought to save and protect society with its holy message. So that's what prophets do. They say, David does corruption with Bathsheba, or Shlomo does Avodah Zarah, and the Navi's on his back and nails him and says, you're in trouble. Okay? But, were prophets successful? What do you think? No. A few of them were, right? But the prophet's general message, right, if you've read Yeshaya, they always say, if you carry on this way, you know what's going to happen to you? You're going to lose your land, and the temple's going to be destroyed, and you're going to go into exile. So, exactly. We went into exile. We lost our land. We lost our sovereignty, right? It seems like ultimately their message was not so successful, right? And the way that Chazal put this is they say that the moment when Achashverosh took his ring and gave it to Haman was more effective. A good bit of good old anti-Semitism was more effective than 48 Nevi'im and Sheva Nevi'ot. Right? That's the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. That's terrible, right? People don't listen. We never listen to the prophets. Or, I don't know, Rabbi Sachs once said, the Bible's been much more successful, since it was published, right? He said, since it happened, right? When it was live, it wasn't so good, but on the reruns, we did much better, right?
It's funny when you think about which prophets were successful. You could say Yonah was successful in getting Nineveh to do Avodah Zarah, but even that's not Bnei Israel, so it's the same thing. We weren't the ones who were listening to the Nevi'im, but even the successes were not for us.
Right. Well, it's actually also very interesting how, it's very difficult when you're actually being told something and then you have a reaction against it. So it's actually much easier to listen to somebody saying something to someone else and then take a message from it. Maybe that's also part of it. Whichever way, look at the bottom line here of page 2, where it's bolded. What prophecy with its impassioned and fiery exhortations could not accomplish in purging the Jewish people of idolatry and in uprooting the roots of the most degrading forms of oppression and violence, of murder, of sexual perversity and bribery, was accomplished by the sages through the expansion of Torah, by raising many disciples, and by the formulation and assiduous study of the particular laws of their derivatives. And he has this line, which we know from Tefillah, Halichot olam lo, where halichot mean the paths lead to him, al tikra halichot ela halachot. The halachot were more effective than the messages, right? Why? Because halachot are practical. Halachot get into your lives, right? Halachot,
by turning the nation into a religion, they say.
Maybe like that, right? By the way, the person who says it exactly that way is Rav Kook. He has another article where he says in the first temple we had ha'inyan Elohi, we related directly to God. But in the second temple we had ha'inyan hadati. He said religion became more of a religion. And it became more religion. It ironically became more successful. Right? In other words, the idea that Judaism literally regulates everything we do sometimes we have this phrase, right? God is in the details, right? In America, sometimes they say the devil's in the details. But for our purpose, God's in the details, okay? That might be the second bit of the shit, the devil's in the details. But God's in the details because, again, sometimes people say, what, if I can't carry a tissue on Shabbat, if I have to worry about taking the psolet from the ochel or the ochel from the... What difference does it make? And the answer is, I guess, maybe it doesn't make a difference in what, obviously it's a halakha, but would it mean that you wouldn't have Shabbat? If I text on Shabbat, does it mean I won't keep Shabbat? Well, the point is that Chazal built Shabbat with so many things, from Shabbat candles, as we said, to Zemirot Shabbat, to our tefillot, to our Shabbat clothes, to all of the different halachot, to everything. So how many things can you take out of that, when you make a pyramid of cups, till the pyramid falls down? When you play Jenga, how many pieces can you take out before the tower falls down? The point is, they wanted it to be thick. They wanted it to be a thick culture, right? Till I once was reached a certain age, and my health insurance company sent me for a medical check. Right, I want to check my heart, so they put all these things, and they say come with sneakers and come change, and we'll put you on a treadmill. Right, and I run regularly. Right, so I thought I'm up for this. So I bring my sneakers, I change, whatever. I'm on the treadmill. They touch it up to 15% incline. And they say, run. They turn up and I'm running, and I think I'm doing pretty well. And then I finish. And I start, finish the test. The nurse is in the room with me. And she's processing the results, and she's going to tell me. I'm busy, I had taken off my shirt and my tzitzit, and I put my tzitzit back on my shirt and start putting on my shoes. And I hear the nurse in the corner, a woman with big kisui rosh, and she's going, I'm like, how's the test? And she goes, athletic results. You're great. I'm like, okay. Carry on getting dressed. I'm like, okay, lady, excuse me. What is going on here? She goes, a man like you've got tzitzit. I saw you brought in a Gemara. You were holding a Gemara. And you put on your left shoe before your right shoe? You should be ashamed of yourself, right? Well, welcome to Jerusalem, right? There are even halachot about which shoe you put on first, right? Right. So in other words, Chazal get into this now. The way Rav Kook puts it, I'm back on page 2. But look at the paragraph. It says the fine fibers here, right? He says hasarot dakot, right? The small fibers. Shemehem istarfot avot hagala shel chatat. What does he compare halacha to? Right? When there's a big rope which can anchor a ship. Well, you look at it closely, and it's made of smaller ropes, and that's made of smaller ropes till you get to fine fibers. He imagines every fiber is like a halacha, right? And all those halachot accumulate to a thick rope, right? So he says, the fibers which form the great ropes of sin, the small capillaries, veins, which form up the Mizrukei Adam HaGdolim, Elahim HaMustarim HaTzfunim Me'en Kol Navi V'Chozeh. These ropes, I started reading Hebrew, I forgot. These are hidden from every Navi. And he says, HaMitzvot HaMasiyot, the practical mitzvot, U'Pratei Chotehem, and all their minor details, B'chol Diyukam HaNimratz, with their incredible detail. Ech B'Hemshech HaZman Alidei, and listen to these 4 things, Kiyumam, keeping them, Talmudam, learning them, Hergelam V'Chibatam, making them second nature and loving them. We interpret halakha both by keeping it, by learning it, by making it second nature, that's okay, and also by loving it. And then they will release their inner energy, the energy of Shabbat, the energy of whatever it might be, and they will fill our lives. So basically what he wants to claim is, there are 2 different routes. I can talk to you about big ideas, and those are the prophets or the poets, right? But they don't necessarily affect people's lives. But the rabbis did something amazing. They translated everything into practicalities and into practical plan, and that's phenomenal, right? And that is what gave Judaism its resilience to be able. Why are we still here after 2,000 years, whereas the previous, after 70 years of Galut, Judaism was literally falling apart? Because of those changes which were made during Beit Sheni, like the brachot, kedushot, tefillot, havdalot, muktzah, whatever it might be, which gave an infrastructure in order to bolster really important things like Shabbat, like Tefillah, like the connection with God. So the connection with God was translated into Tefillot and Brachot, and Shabbat was translated, and so forth, to so many other halachot. And it's true that therefore halakha developed in a way that nobody had ever imagined. But in this regard, Chacham adif minavi, right? In this sense, we can say Chacham adif minavi means Chacham is more, what would we say, resilient, more robust, more long-lasting, more effective, impactful, etc., etc. Now we're not finished because I want to. What's beautiful about Rav Kook is Rav Kook's very intellectually honest, and Rav Kook says that even though this was halacha in a sense was this great solution, even it has its own problems, right? And here I'm literally going to the last two paragraphs, and then maybe if people want to raise points for questions or discussions, I'm up for it. Rav Kook then says, remember, Rav Kook lived through the end of the 19th century, and he was seeing the real effects of emancipation, and let's call it secularization over many of the much of the Zionist movement. Many of the early Zionists dropped their religion. Right? There's a poem by somebody called Avram Shlonsky. Avram Shlonsky was actually a neighbor of the Lubavitcher Rebbe as a child. They played in each other's houses. Very fascinating to read. But he became a Zionist, came to Israel, and he writes a poem. And he says, and he talks about he talks about the houses and the roads being built on the land of Israel, the houses and the roads. And he says, these are, instead of my tefillin, I have these houses and roads. Right? Think about it. Think about looking at a landscape with houses and roads, and it looks like the roads and the houses, right? In other words, he says, I don't need tefillin. The land of Israel is my tefillin, right? People were rejecting. They said, and you know what? I'll say it even more than that. Achad Ha'am, one of the very early Zionists in one of the early Zionist congresses, he turned around to Herzl. He said, Herzl, you were affected by anti-Semitism. We all know the Dreyfus affair. Your story is the story of the Western Jews, the Jews of France and Germany. You always wanted to fit into the West. They wouldn't have you. And therefore you said, great, we'll go and make our own country. Right? They want us to have it in their country, so we'll make our own country and we'll be free citizens in our own country. But we are Eastern Jews. We're Polish and we're Russian. In other words, what he was saying was, we're not secularized, we're religious. And he says, and our problem is not about fitting in. Our problem is actually about Judaism. We're sick of Judaism being about all the small things. We don't want it to be about the left shoe and the right shoe. We don't want Judaism to be about whether I finish. Did you say Mashiv Baruch Amar Hashem, or did you not? Did you say it before you said Baruch Atah or not? When Israel had to create Ivrit, they had a choice between what words to use. In the Torah, what is the word for a tree, for example? An etz. In the Mishnah, right? What is the word for a tree? Ilan. So when they had to choose, what? So when they had to choose for Ivrit, they always preferred the Tanachi word. So, like for example, you have, because it's rabbinic, Kiddush Levana, right? But actually in Bereshit it is the Areach, and Ivrit always preferred the Tanachi. Why? Because the early Zionists wanted to go back to the Tanakh. They wanted to go back to the time when we had kings, governments, when we had wars. They said, Judaism isn't about your left shoe and your right shoe, or the drop of milk which fell into it, is it Batel B'Shishim. Judaism, we read the Tanakh. Judaism is about whether we have a land and an economy and an agriculture, and we want to go back to that. In other words, well, I'll put it in the words of Rav Kook. In the course of time, the concern with the work of the sages predominated over the work of the prophets. And the institution of prophecy ceased altogether. After some time, the general principles declined, and they were imminent in the particulars, but they were not readily apparent. In other words, what he says is like this. Spirituality is a beautiful idea, but it became absorbed into, let's call it tefillah. And now all we worried was hilchot tefillah. What was lost? The sense of the presence of God. All we were left with was, are you saying the words? Did you say them right? Did you say them right? Right? But people forgot about the spiritual idea which was behind it. They forgot about the ideas of rest and social justice which were in Shabbat, and they just started worrying about Shabbat. They stopped worrying about all those things. They were inherent in the particulars, but they weren't noticeable. Right? Like that phrase, you can't see the wood from the trees, right? Can't see the forest from the trees. At the end of the present epoch, when the light of prophecy will begin to have its revival, he says, we need prophecy to come back. Why? There'll be developed a reaction, a disdain for the particulars. In other words, halakha will have thickened so much. We had and then it was written in the Mishnah, and then the Gemara expanded, and then the Rishonim, and then the Achronim. It's now become, the balance has gone off again. And therefore, what are we experiencing? People are saying, well, why are there all these rules? I don't see any values here. I don't see any big ideas. Right? Those big ideas, where do I see them? In the Tanakh, but I don't see them in lived Judaism. I don't see it in the Halakha. And he says, therefore, there'll be a disdain for the particulars. This is alluded to in the Talmudic statement from Sotah, that in the dawn of the Messianic age, the wisdom of the sages will become unsavory, and those who live on the boundary. It says, "Anshe ha'gvul elu talmidei chachamim shemesimim gvul ledivreihem yalchu me'ir me'ir lo yechonanu." In other words, people will say they'll be running away from Judaism. They'll say Judaism is oppressive and it's all rule-based and it doesn't relate to me. Like Achad Ha'am said, my problem is the problem of Judaism. I want to go back to a Judaism which has impact and deals with real things. He says this will continue until the radiance of prophecy will re-emerge from its hiding and reveal itself not as unripe fruit. It used to be unripe, but now it's ripened. Right? It's ripe fruit, first fruits, full of vitality and life. And prophecy itself will acknowledge the great achievements of the sages, and in righteous humility will say, even prophecy will say, Chacham adif min avi. We need halachas, we'll say nevuah, we can't manage without it, but this transcending of one-sidedness will be expressed by the vision of unity expressed by the psalmist, where he says, Chesed ve'emet nifgashu, tzedek v'shalom nashaku, emet me'eretz titzmach. What's emet me'eretz titzmach? What comes up from the land? We create the emet, right? But tzedek mishamayim nishkaf, tzedek will come from the heavens. In other words, the nevuah and the halacha have to merge. How did Rav Kook think about this? Well, when you read about Rav Kook, he always talks about along when you're learning Talmud, right? You have to learn along with the halacha, you have to learn the Agadah. And he was interested all the time in fusions, right? He was interested in, he really believed that part of the curriculum in the yeshivot should not only be as it was in the Eastern European yeshivot, just learning through, Talmudic sugyot with a lot of mental gymnastics, but he wanted there to be also a curriculum of machshava with emunot v'deot and all sorts of things, not just musar, learn how to become better, but actually to have a richer philosophical vocabulary. And he wanted also for there to be Tanakh. And, I, as a Tanakh teacher, I actually feel, one of my friends who's a Gemara teacher, he said, it's funny, whenever I give a Tanakh Dvar Torah, I talk about God a lot. But when I talk about Gemara, I don't talk about God a lot, right? So one of the advantages of talking about Tanakh, because you end up having to encounter spiritual ideas. And the challenge, I think, when I teach Gemara, is actually to be able to connect the details to a much bigger picture. But effectively, what Rav Kook has done is taken us on a very long journey. He says we had the Torah, obviously, but we had a lot of the preaching that we had. A lot of our halachot are related to national institutions like the Mikdash and other things. But there were certain personal observances that hadn't yet been developed. The personal observances of Shabbat, personal or home rituals, tefillah, v'chulei, v'chulei. And he says those started being developed during Beit Sheni, and they took us through into Galut. Halacha thickened, and the emancipation for a lot of Jews was a pushback, was a kickback against those sorts of things. And now we need to actually be feeling those again. By the way, what the prophets spoke about was the Kedusha of Hashem's, what I would call broadly spirituality, and fighting against injustice, what we might call today social justice. So these values need to be more present in our Jewish landscape. And we need to find ways whenever, and therefore I think a big challenge, whenever we're teaching halakha, and or let's put it this way, whenever we're teaching Tanakh, we have to try and connect it into people's practical lives. Whenever we're teaching halakha, we have to connect it back to ideas. And I think that's a lot of what Rav Kook wanted to do. But it's also fascinating that he was able to see this very long journey, which he calls Chacham Adif Min Avi. So we just did a very, a very whistle-stop tour of 3,000 years of Jewish intellectual history. And if anybody wants to comment or question or comment, or maybe a thought welled up in your mind and you want to share, feel free. Yes.
I wanted to say that Hashem himself, when Yahweh was searching for him back in Korea, and he goes through this whole, Hashem, kill me now, or whatever, I can't do this anymore.
Right.
And Hashem tells him, you're not going to see me in these big, great visions. And the only thing that hear me in this cold and right, you have to listen to me. So that big revelation is not necessarily the paradigm from which Judaism is supposed to be built around.
Nice.
Anyway.
Nice.
It is the system,
right.
so to speak.
Right.
And through the system is when you're going to find God.
Right. By the way, a lot of times that happens, let's say, even we realize in business when, systems make a really big difference, right? And, it can be, you do have to translate things sometimes into protocols in order to bring a company to profitability, whatever it is. Sometimes it really does translate into the systems you're using, and shifting the system a bit can make a big difference. Yes?
So where did the prophets go? Just to answer the actual question of
Okay.
No, I don't mean that.
Okay, so Chazal.
That God removed them because they weren't
Right.
working.
So the truth is that yes, there is a tradition that either with the loss of the Beit Hamikdash, or sometime afterwards, with the last prophets Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, prophecy ended. Now,
Obviously we don't know a lot about this time, but did people react to that in any way?
so I assume they were, well, again, maybe they were sorry. It's interesting that when you read the last prophet, who was Malachi, essentially, you read through, it's only 3 chapters of Malachi, but it really is actually an argument between the people and the prophet. And it's almost as if he keeps on saying, do this, and they say, no, we're not going to. It's almost like they're rejecting the prophet. When you read Malachi, you really get that sense. And the last side of Malachi is actually Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi, right? Remember the Torah of Moshe. Like, I'm checking out. In the meantime, keep the halakha. You know what to do, but you don't need me anymore. Now, I will say that some people want to argue that that there was a sort of like when we get to Second Temple time, we're already getting to the Greek age, right? Now, it's true that even the Greeks and the Romans still practice sacrifice, but now we come into an era in which philosophy is coming more into its own, and people are going to, slowly, things are going to be phased out in terms of sacrifice. And therefore, some people want to actually claim that during the Beit Mikdash, there was a system which worked better, which was Nevu'ah, right? And Korbanot. And that was a system for that period of time. And that for a period of time in which there was going to be other, call it intellectual tools, what was more important was to develop our own intellectual tools. And therefore maybe the idea of Chazal was almost like a divine pushing us ahead on the intellectual route. I don't need to be giving you messages anymore. You're going to have to deal with philosophy to start developing your own intellectual forums.
Like the Wa became outdated to fight
Something like that. So some people want to go in that direction, but I think that's a bit conjecture. There aren't explicit texts which say that. All the texts say is that with the end of the Beit Mikdash or the last Nevi'im, Nevuah phased out. Now, again, I will just add one other thing, which is you still have people talking about in Beit Sheni Ruach HaKodesh, or in the time of the rabbis, Bat Kol. Or even in today, people talk about Dat Torah. So, there's always this sense there must be somebody, some great rabbi, who actually has a sixth sense and actually gets a message from God, right? In other words, we find it very difficult to let go of Nebuah. So, we have people in the Gemara who hear a Bat Kol, right? I love the word Bat Kol, right? Bat Kol it's not a kol, it's a daughter of a kol. If you can imagine what a kol is, and you can think about what the daughter maybe looked like, it's an echo of a Nebuah. Yeah, there are. Well, the Rambam as well. It seems like. So people find it very difficult to think that there's no direct line. No direct. People go to Hasidic Rebbes and Babas to get brachot for the same reason.
So once you have the Chacham Adif Min Aviv, is there anything beneficial? Like, what would be the benefit of bringing back that Navi? I mean, you talked about spirituality, but what really does it bring if the halakha was so successful?
So I think if you look, if he's right that Nevuah is big picture Judaism, is let's call it, for want of a better word, values and spirituality, and the halakha is the practical translation of that. Sometimes we need to be reminded of the big picture, and we need to feel like
Does halakha have that incorporated into it, and some people are just missing it? Or is it something that is external to halakha?
Look, Rav Soloveitchik, for example, that was his argument with Heschel, who was also a Hasidic thinker. Rav Rav Soloveitchik said the very lovely story when Rabbi Sachs met Rav Soloveitchik as a 21-year-old student, and he said, "This is what Rav Soloveitchik taught me." He says, "Everything in Judaism begins with halakha. You want to develop a philosophy? Start with the halakha." And that's, if you've read any of Rav Soloveitchik's stuff, he always, his shiurim, he always brings a sort of halachic paradigms and then throws them up to be philosophical. And if you read halakha that way, then you say the values are inherent in the halakha, and it's my job as a rabbi to bring it out. And I think Rav Soloveitchik was a genius in being able to do that. But you've got to be able to, sit in a 3-hour class to do that. And the question is, the Nevi'im were actually talking about the practical application in terms of society. I mean, I think one idea is also that Nevi'im were always talking for now. I mean, Rav Kook doesn't say this. Nevi'im were always talking for the present moment, whereas halakha is something which is steady for all time. And one of the things we sometimes lack, I mean, I certainly feel it, since 7 October, everybody's like, okay, what's the message? Like, what are we thinking now? And that's where Nevi'im always spoke to the moment. So that's why it's always difficult even to read Yeshayahu Yirmiyahu, because we're actually not sure what moment they're talking to. But Nevi'im are talking to the moment. Now, of course, anybody will give any message about Israel, and some people will say, I don't agree. So of course the Nevi'im got pushed back, but the Nevi'im were always talking to the now, whereas halakha is much more, it's much more the marathon runner than the sprinter in that sense. It's
You wouldn't say it's the opposite, that the Navi is speaking to eternity, and that's why the Torah is so everlasting, whereas the halakha is the rabbinic wisdom divinely inspired by the prophet's words to try and help us allow it to be halicha. But sometimes that's why we need to constantly evolve with it, because if we're not opening halakha to make it halicha, we lose the divinely inspired wisdom.
Okay, it's a nice way of saying it. Okay.
I looked at it the opposite way.
All right, I like that. I think that's a different way. Anybody else? Feel free. No, tough crowd. A lovely crowd. Toda Rabbi. Thank you for coming out on Motzei Shabbat. Thank you. I hope it's food for thought. Sometimes we need to think on this meta level. So maybe, Toda.